Okay, today's daf is Tadivav. We're going to start where we left off yesterday, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines down. 12 lines down from the top. Uman Shabbat le Shabbat Zeman Tefillin. So who is the Tana that holds that Shabbat is Zeman Tefillin? It's the time of Tefillin. In other words, we see that there's some kind of machloket here about whether Tefillin can be worn on Shabbat. So who is the one who says that Shabbat is Zeman Tefillin? So Rabbi Akiva. It must be Rabbi Akiva. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, V'shamarta tachoka hazot ne'mo'adam yamim yamima. Everybody should recognize this pasuk as in the Tefillin that we read every day. That you should guard this statute Lemo'ada in its time, miyamim yamima. Now literally, what does yamim yamima mean? Miyamim yamima literally means from year to year. And in the literal pasuk, it's referring to Korban Pesach, observing Pesach from year to year. If you read the psukim, this is what you will see. However, it's interpreted in connection with Tefillin as well, because it's in the parasha of Tefillin. So it says, miyamim yamima means yamim velo lelot. Yamim means day and not night. Miyamim means, always means a limitation. Some of the days, velo kol yamim prat shabbatot v'yamim tovim divrei Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says that there are two exceptions to the rule of Tefillin. One is yom velo laila, days and not night, and the other one is not shabbatot and chagim. And where do we learn this from? We learn this. The word yamim tells you that it's daytime, not nighttime, and miyamim means just a portion of days, meaning not Shabbatot and not Yamim Tovim. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Lo nemar chukazo el linyan Pesach bilvad. Rabbi Akiva says that this whole pasuk is really only talking about Pesach. It's not talking about Tefillin. So ostensibly he would reject both of these limudim. He's rejecting the limud that Tefillin only applies during the day, and he's also rejecting the limud that Tefillin is not on Shabbat and not on Yom Tov. So we can conclude that he holds that you could wear Tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So then the Gemara asks, but wait a second. What about the following Mishnah? Ha-Pesach v'amilah mitzvot aseh. It says that Pesach and Milah are both positive commandments. Lema delaka Rabbi Akiva. That seems to contradict Rabbi Akiva. Why? De'i Rabbi Akiva, because according to Rabbi Akiva, Kivan demokela, but Pesach lav nami'ika. Because according to Rabbi Akiva, what does v'shamarta tachuka hazot mean? You should guard this statute. It's talking about Korban Pesach. And shamarta, usually, lishmor means a negative commandment. As it says, as we said, Kid Rabbi Avin, Amar Rabbi Eli, as Rabbi Avin said, that Rabbi Eli said, the Amar Rabbi Avin, Amar Rabbi Eli, Kol makom shneimar hishamer pen ve'al. Whenever in the Torah it says hishamer, guard, pen, lest, or al, don't. So then, eno ela belo ta'aseh. These all identify negative commandments. So the famous case is hishamer benega tzaraat. Be careful with tzaraat, from which we learn you're not allowed to cut the tzaraat off your body. It's a negative commandment. It's a lo ta'aseh. So here, according to Rabbi Akiva, that v'shamarta et hachuka hazot is referring to Pesach. He must mean that there's a negative commandment. Not only is the Torah telling you to bring Korban Pesach, but it's telling you don't neglect the Pesach. It's a negative commandment, not just a positive commandment. Because it says shamarta. So that contradicts the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says that Pesach is only a positive commandment. So what does the Gemara say? Afilu tema Rabbi Akiva. Even Rabbi Akiva could be reconciled with the Mishnah, because hishamer de lav lav, hishamer de aseh aseh. Because it depends. Sometimes the word lishmor refers to a negative, like when we say, for example, shamor et yom HaShabbat, guard the Shabbat, it means don't do malacha, it's the negative. Other times, lishmor could mean the positive. So in this case, v'shamarta tachuka zot means guard the positive commandment of bringing the Pesach. V'savar Rabbi Akiva Shabbat zeman tefillino. But let's go back to the basic question we asked, which was, does Rabbi Akiva really, now we dealt in other words with the side point of, can Rabbi Akiva really say that the pasuk v'shamarta is referring to Korban Pesach? We said, okay, we can work that out, we can reconcile that. But does Rabbi Akiva really hold that Shabbat is a proper time for tefillin? V'hatanya, we learned in a Braita, Rabbi Akiva says, Yachol yaniach adam tefillin b'shabbatot v'yamim tovim. Rabbi Akiva himself said, you might think that you should put on tefillin on Shabbatot and Yamim tovim. Talmud Amar, the pasuk says, Vayalecha le'ot al yadecha. It shall be for you a sign upon your hand, mi shetzrichin ot. Yatzu elo shehen gufan ot. That this is referring to times where you need a sign, because it says you should tie it as a sign, and ot upon your arm. But that excludes things which are themselves a sign, such as Shabbat. That's a famous reason why we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat, because since Shabbat is already oti ben yovenechem, it's a sign, and tefillin is leot al yadecha. You don't need an extra ot. You already have Shabbat. You don't need tefillin. So that's the way that Rabbi Akiva learns it. So clearly Rabbi Akiva is not the one who says you wear tefillin on Shabbat, because he explicitly says in the Braita that you don't wear tefillin on Shabbat. Ella hay tanahu. It must be the following Tanah D'Tanya, as we learned in the Braita, Hane or balayla rata choletz rata maniach. Divrei Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Natan says that at nighttime, if you're awake at night, you can take off your tefillin or you can leave them on. You can even put them on. In other words, what does that mean? Nighttime is zman tefillin. Correct? Okay. However, Yonatan Kitoni says, "En menichayin tefillin balayla." Okay, we don't put on tefillin at night, but Rabbi Natan just said we could, right? So maybe he's the one. Remember, we learned from the same pasuk, miyamim yamima, right? Miyamim yamima means day and not night. Miyamim yamima also means not Shabbat and not Yom Tov. So perhaps then, therefore, Rabbi Natan, just like he says that you can put on tefillin at night, he also says that you put on tefillin on Shabbat. Can we not infer from the fact that nighttime is acceptable for tefillin, Shabbat is also an acceptable time for tefillin? Dilma svira lelayla zeman tefillinu. Shabbat lav zeman tefillinu. It's possible to say Shabbat loves Zaman Tefillinu. It's possible to maintain that Laila is the time for Tefillin, but not Shabbat. How so? And what's the proof? Because Rabbi Akiva himself says that. Because Rabbi Akiva disagrees with the Chachamim who say that daytime is the only time you can wear Tefillin, because he says Yamim Yamima is a reference to Korban Pesach, not to the time of Tefillin. And yet, he also holds that you don't wear Tefillin on Shabbat because Oti ben Yovenechem. So maybe Rabbi Natan holds the same thing.
Oh.
It's two different issues. In other words, it's two separate issues. You can't derive one from the other. It must be the following Tanah D'Tanya, as we said in the Baraita, Michal bat Kushi. Michal bat Kushi is talking about Michal bat Shaul. Okay? Michal bat Shaul, Hayita manachat tefillin. She used to put on tefillin, v'lo michuba chachamim. And the chachamim did not argue against her. So she was like one of the women of the wall, that they make a big deal, right? She wore tefillin, and but at that time the Beit HaMikdash was not in Yerushalayim. So they were still having the Mishkan back then. V'ishto shel Yonah, Hayita ola regel, v'lo michuba chachamim. And the wife of Yonah the prophet, Yonah ben Amittai, that we read about on Yom Kippur afternoon, his wife used to make aliyah l'regel, even though it says kol zachar.
Where did we learn about Yonah?
It's just a tradition. It doesn't say a source. It doesn't say a pasuk. It never mentions Ishto shel Yonah in the pasuk. But the wife of Yonah, according to the Midrash, and according to here, that's brought as a tradition, that she used to go up to Aliyah l'regel, even though it says all of your zuchurcha, kol zuchurcha, all your males have to go, not the women, but she would go anyway. All right. Also, we see that Chana went Aliyah l'regel too. So women would go, and they didn't argue with that. Now, we're going to follow in our interpretation of the sugya Rashi's interpretation. At the end, I'll mention another interpretation if we have time, but I'm going to just go with Rashi because it's simple and it's straightforward. So, midlo michuba chachamim, from the fact that the rabbis did not protest against, let's say, Michal bat Shaul wearing tefillin, alma kasavre mitzvat aseh shelo azaman geramari. That means, what does that mean? That must mean that she's obligated in tefillin. In other words, the assumption here is that if they didn't tell Michal bat Shaul not to wear tefillin, then obviously she was obligated in tefillin, because it's not a mitzvah aseh shazman gerama. It's not a time-bound mitzvah. It must be a mitzvah that applies day and night, 365 days a year, because any positive mitzvah that has a limit, women are not obligated. For example, tzitzit, because it's only day and not night, women are not obligated. So tefillin must be an round-the-clock, 24/7 mitzvah. And that would include Shabbat. So, therefore, they did not protest against Michal bat Shaul. So this must be the Tanah that holds that tefillin applies at night and also on Shabbat. That's why Michal bat Shaul wore tefillin. Assumption being, of course, that there's no middle ground. There's no idea that she had the option, but she wasn't required. Either she's required or she's not allowed.
So
and that's how.
they didn't.
It's a good point. That's a good point. Now, that's the difficulty actually with this interpretation, with Rashi's interpretation. Why does it say lo michuba chachamim? They didn't protest. Why would they not protest? Of course they didn't protest. It's a mitzvah. Right? Okay, so we'll see. So Vidilma Savarla, and maybe he holds Rabbi Yosef, like Rabbi Yosef. Damar Nashim Somechot Rishut. This is a very famous case of halacha in Masekhet Chagiga is the basis. It talks about Semicha. Semicha was on korbanot when they would bring the V'samach Yadu Rosh Korbano Ushchato. It says that you have to lean on the korban before you slaughter it. Now it says that Bnei Yisrael Somechim. Velo benot Yisrael somachot. Okay, Bnei Yisrael. Let's say that men do semicha, but women who bring korbanot, they don't have to do semicha. Okay, so what does that mean? So that means they're not required, but Rabbi Yosef says nonetheless, nashim somachot reshut, that they have the option of doing semicha. Now this is a little bit of a chidush on two levels. First of all, if we're saying that a woman is only allowed to do a mitzvah that she's obligated to do, she's not allowed to do a mitzvah that she's not obligated to do, as Rashi says here, and the Ran also says it in Masekhet Rosh Hashanah, if I'm not mistaken, because of Bal Tosif. It's like adding a mitzvah. You're not obligated in the mitzvah, why are you adding it? Right? So it's the same thing here. With semicha, if the woman is not obligated in doing semicha, she shouldn't be allowed to do it. That's number one. Number two, because it's mishtamesh b'kodashim. Because when you lean on a korban, you're actually like resting your weight on the korban. If it's not a mitzvah, then you're using the korban for your personal, to lean on it. That's not acceptable. So there's actually a problem with doing it. But let's just go with the basic reasoning here, which is if a person's not obligated in something, then by doing it, you're adding on to the mitzvah. So, and yet Rabbi Yosef still says, no, you have the voluntary option of doing it. So maybe it's the same thing. Michal bat Shaul wasn't obligated in tefillin. Tefillin doesn't apply in Shabbat, and it doesn't apply at night, but she had the option of doing it, and she took the option. Because if you're not going to say this, that it was an optional undertaking of Michal bat Shaul, then Ishto shel Yonah, right? It says that Ishto shel Yonah used to go up, the wife of Yonah, the prophet, used to go up for Aliyah l'regel. Is there anybody who holds that Aliyah l'regel, going up for the holidays to Yerushalayim, is not a time-bound positive mitzvah? It's one of the prototypes of a positive time-bound mitzvah, and that's one of the bases for the concept that that women are not obligated in positive mitzvot shazman garama that are time bound. So therefore, ela kasavar reshut hachanami reshut. It must be just like by aliyah l'regel, by going up to Yerushalayim for the holidays. It's clearly optional, not required, because that's explicit in the Torah that it's only the men that are required. So to the tefillin, it's only an optional thing. It must be rather the following Tana who maintains that Shabbat is the Zman Tefillin. We still haven't found anybody who convincingly can be shown to maintain that Shabbat is a proper time for Tefillin. So the Tanya says in the Braita Motzei Tefillin machnisan zug zug echad ish ve'echad isha, that somebody who finds Tefillin outside, as we learned in the Mishnah at the beginning of the Perek, can wear them one pair at a time, a woman or a man. Whether they're new tefillin, meaning that they don't show the signs of having been tied in knots for tefillin, or yeshanot, that they have been tied and used for tefillin. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is telling us two inclusive statements. Number one, that add on to what's in our Mishnah. One is that whether it's a man or a woman, so even if a woman sees tefillin lying out, she can put on the tefillin on her arm and on her head and walk in with it on Shabbat. And even if they're chadashot, which means the knots haven't been tied in the straps, so you can't tell definitively. Maybe it's a kameah, maybe it's an amulet. It's not a tefillin, but looks like a tefillin. Still, he says you can do it. Rabbi Yehuda oser b'chadashot umatir b'ishanot. Rabbi Yehuda prohibits chadashot, meaning if there's no clear evidence, in other words, if there's no knot tied into the straps that demonstrates clearly that this is tefillin. We're going to see more about this in tomorrow's daf, actually. But if there's no clear knot that shows that it's tefillin, because we said that they used to make these amulets that looked like tefillin, but they didn't have the knots, so then you can't bring them in. So what do you see here? It would seem that what? Ad kan lo peligei ela b'chadashot v'yishanot. So here Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir are only arguing about chadashot and yishanot. In other words, that according to Rabbi Meir, even the new ones, even the ones that haven't been tied into knots, you can bring in on Shabbat. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can only wear in the ones that are tied into knots. But when it comes to a woman doing it, they didn't argue. So what do we conclude from this? That both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir must hold that wearing tefillin is not a time-bound mitzvah. It's not a positive time-bound mitzvah because you see that the woman is allowed to wear the tefillin and to bring them in, just like the man. And they mention both the man and the woman, which would indicate then that they're allowed to, that they wear them normally. In other words, that women wear tefillin because it's not a positive time-bound mitzvah. It's a positive timeless mitzvah, that doesn't have a time limit. And therefore, it applies on Shabbat as well. So now the Gemara says, "V'dil masavar like Rabbi Yosei," but maybe they hold like Rabbi Yosei. Amar nashim somachot reshut. Maybe we could say that they hold like Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Yosei says that even though there are certain mitzvot that women are not obligated in, they're allowed to do them if they so desire. So maybe here too, they see tefillin. They put the tefillin on because they want to bring them into the courtyard. Now, really, they're not obligated in the mitzvah of tefillin, and because mitzvah of tefillin doesn't apply in Shabbat. The only thing is, if they wanted to wear tefillin during the week, they would be allowed to. So therefore, they are allowed to wear them in even on Shabbat. But that doesn't mean there's a mitzvah to wear them on Shabbat. And the Gemara says, "Lo salka datach." Don't assume that. Dilak Rabbi Meir savar like Rabbi Yosef, v'lo Rabbi Yehuda savar like Rabbi Yosef, because neither Rabbi Meir nor Rabbi Yehuda maintain the position of Rabbi Yosef. How so? Lo Rabbi Meir savar like Rabbi Yosef ditnan. How do we know that Rabbi Meir disagrees with Rabbi Yosef? Because it says in the Mishnah Masekhet Rosh Hashanah, "En ma'akavin et hatinokot militkoa." It says we don't stop the children from blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Now, really, on Rosh Hashanah, the shofar is muktzeh. We don't stop them, meaning we let them play with the shofar. That's a Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. Now, why? Because normally playing musical instruments you're not allowed to on Yom Tov, right? You're not allowed to. But we do it for the mitzvah. But if you just say, you know what, I'm going to go and play some more. I want to play some jazz music on the shofar or something like that. You're not allowed to. It's not like because it's Rosh Hashanah you can play the shofar as much as you want. Only for the mitzvah. We don't stop the children. Ha nashim me'akvin. But the implication is that a woman is not allowed to blow the shofar. Why? Because since she's not obligated in blowing the shofar, she's not allowed to do it. It's a chilul yom tov. She's not allowed to decide she's going to do it. And ustam matnitin Rabbi Meir, and a stam mishnah, a mishnah that doesn't have an identified author. We always assume it's Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is saying women are not allowed to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. We don't let them. We don't. It's a mitzvah tasei shezman grama, so we don't allow them to do it. And therefore, with tefillin also, if tefillin were a mitzvah tasei shezman grama, a positive tam-bound mitzvah, Rabbi Meir would also not allow women to do it. And velo Rabbi Yehuda savar like Rabbi Yosef, and similarly Rabbi Yehuda does not maintain like Rabbi Yosef. The Tanya, as it says in the Braita, the Bnei Yisrael v'samach, because it says speak to Bnei Yisrael, and then in that same paragraph it says that they should lean on the korbanot that they bring. Bnei Yisrael somachin ve'en Bnot Yisrael samachot, which means that Bnei Yisrael lean, but Bnot Yisrael do not lean. Rabbi Yosef ve'Rabbi Shimon omrim nashim samachot reshut, that according to Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon, they say, you know what? It's optional. Women are allowed to lean if they want to, but they're not required to. And who's the Tanakama? The Tanakama says that women can't do it. So who is the Tanakama? Ustam sifra mani, Rabbi Yehuda. And what a stam sifra? Anytime we have a sifra, okay, which is a commentary on the book of Vayikra, it's a midrash halacha in the book of Vayikra, and it doesn't have an author, it's Rabbi Yehuda. So what does that mean? That means that Rabbi Yehuda is the one that says women cannot do optional mitzvot. So therefore, since Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir both maintain that a woman is allowed to put on the tefillin to bring them into the chatzer, that must mean that they don't consider a woman putting on tefillin to be something that's bal tosif, that's adding on to her repertoire of mitzvot, which must mean that they hold that the mitzvah of tefillin applies even on Shabbat. The mitzvah of tefillin must be a 7-day-a-week mitzvah and a 24-hour-a-day positive mitzvah for women to be obligated. And they must hold that women are obligated, because if they didn't hold that women were obligated, then they wouldn't allow the woman to wear they wouldn't allow the woman to wear it to bring it in on Shabbat either. Okay, because it would be considered, adding on to the mitzvah would be considered something that she's not allowed to do normally, and it would be like carrying it. So, because it wouldn't be recognized as an act that was, appropriate for a woman to do at any time. So therefore we must say that it's Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda who hold that women are obligated in wearing tefillin, because it's not a mitzvah to say shezman grama. And they would even say that we should all wear tefillin on Shabbat. So this is interesting. Now, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, "Hamotze techelet bashuk." If a person finds techelet, in other words, he finds dyed wool that's dyed with techelet dye, lishonot pisulot. If he finds tongues, in other words, strips of wool that are dyed, then pisulot. Then you can't use them for tzitzit, because the assumption is, what were they made for? Clothing. However, chutin ksherin. If he finds strings that were dyed techelet, then he can assume that they were dyed for the mitzvah of tzitzit. So, ma'ishna lishonot. What's the reason why, if he has strips of wool that are dyed techelet, that it's not valid for? Why can't he just slice those into strings and use them for tzitzit? The answer is because de'amara data deglimat tzav'inu. So we assume that there's a halakhan techelet. I should mention that it has to be dyed lishma. Okay? So therefore, I forgot to mention it. So, it has to be dyed lishma. Well, according to the Rambam, there's actually no mitzvah of tying lishma, only dyeing lishma. Yeah. But, it doesn't matter. According to the Rambam, as long as it's tied by a Jew, that's enough. But the dyeing of techelet has to be lishma. So now most Rishonim, or other Rishonim I should say, I don't know if it's most, I haven't counted, but many Rishonim hold, and the Shulchan Aruch brings that it has to be tied lishma also. But the dyeing of the techelet for sure has to be lishma. So much so that if they were to test, they used to test the dye of techelet by putting a piece of, when you test a dye to see if it's the right color, you put let's say a white cloth to test it. You weren't allowed to do that, because if you tested it, you used it for testing. Now you invalidated the whole batch of techelet. Okay, you weren't allowed to use it for anything. So here we say you take this. So what they would do was they would siphon off some in a cup, and they would test it in a separate cup. Okay, because they want to invalidate it. Now, so what is it? So the chutin nami. So in other words, if you find these pieces of fabric that were dyed techelet, you can't assume that they were dyed l'shem mitzvah, for the sake of the mitzvah. Now, but strings also, maybe the person also dyed strings for the purpose of weaving garments that are colored techelet, a very nice, noble reason. So the answer is b'shuzurim. It's talking about where these are shuzurim. How do you translate shuzurim in English again? What's the word? Twist, right. Yeah, so it's made of multiple threads that they twist together into a thick thread. So if you find twisted threads, because they would generally for tzitzit use the twisted threads. Actually, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you're obligated to use twisted threads.
It's like spinning.
Right? What?
It's like spinning.
Spinning is into the thread itself, isn't it?
I don't know. That's what I'm...
Yeah, spinning is to make thread, and then you would take multiple threads and you would spin them together into a thicker type of thread. Like if you look at your tzitzit, if you look closely at one string, you'll see it's made of multiple strings. If you look closely. Now, so again, though, b'shuzurim nami nema adata de sifta de glima aifenu. Maybe these strings that are shuzurim, that are twisted strings, were made for the embroidering, like for making the edge of a garment. Like you would have a garment, and then on the edge you would make, like around the edge, a decorative loops or whatever with the strings. So the Gemara says, b'mufsakin. If they were cut small size, that's what the Gemara says. In other words, so the only case where if you find techelet, you can assume it was dyed lishma is if there are strings that are shizurim, that are twisted and are cut to a small size. Because a person is not going to cut them to small size and also dye them techelet and cut them to small size like that in order to make a garment. Because then he's going to have to tie them to another one and tie them to another one in order to make a big enough piece. Why would he cut them in small sections like that? Obviously, if they're cut in small sections, they were cut for the making of tzitzit. So, Amar Rava says, you're using what a person would normally do as a basis for making a halachic determination. You're saying, well, would a person really go out of his way to dye something techelet and then cut it like that and it looks just like tzitzit? If it's not really tzitzit, would a person do that? But would a person, so I'll ask you, would a person make a kameah Would a person to make an amulet go so far to make it look exactly like tefillin? That's a big effort to make it look like tefillin. And yet we learned in the Mishnah that we learned that chadashot, that there could be such a thing as what it's called chadashot in the Mishnah, which means that you find a kameah. It's basically a kameah. It's an amulet, but this amulet is made to look almost exactly like tefillin, except for the knot. So wouldn't you normally say, well, who's going to go so far to make something that looks like just tefillin? Who would do that? So you see that it's not a reliable assumption to say who would do that. Because maybe they would. And so too, maybe they would make strings that look just like tzitzit strings. For who knows what the reason is. So Amar Rabbi Zera says, La'ahava Berei, to his son Ahava, beautiful name. Puk tanelo amotze techelet bashuk lishonot pisulin chutin mufsakin kisherein lefi she'en adam toreach. He said, go out and teach the following braita to everyone. Someone who finds techelet in the shuk, if it is swaths of fabric, basically, then we would say that it's invalid because we assume it was made for clothing. But if it's chutin mufsakin, cut strings that are techelet, we assume it's for tzitzit. Because why? The braita tells you the reason. Lefi she'en adam toreach, because a person will not go so far to make something that looks exactly like tzitzit. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava said, Umishum detanela ahava berei de Rabbi Zera kipi talala. Just because Ahava, the son of Rabbi Zera, comes and says something, I'm going to hang rings on it? Meaning, I'm going to attach so much weight to it just because of a braita that I never heard before? No, why would I do that? I'm telling you the Mishnah. In other words, I'm showing you the Mishnah. I'm telling you that it says right in the Mishnah that a person will go out of their way sometimes to do an unusual thing, like make a kameh that looks exactly like tefillin. And maybe they'll also make strings that look exactly like tzitzit. So how can you quote me a braita? I'm quoting you the Mishnah. Ela amar Rava, rather Rava says, tarach velo tarach tanaehi. Really, this is a machloket tanaim. What do we assume when we find an object and we don't know what it is? What do we assume? Detanya, as we learned in a braita, tefillin machnisan zug zug, echad ish ve'echad isha, echad chadashot ve'echad yishanot. We saw this before. That if you find tefillin, bring them in one period of time, whether you're a man or woman, whether they are new or old, meaning even if they would seem like they might be a kameah. That's what Rabbi Meir says. Why? Why does Rabbi Meir say that according to Rava's interpretation? Because he says, you know what? En adam toreach. It's probably tefillin. If even though it doesn't have the knot on it yet, it's probably unfinished tefillin. Because why would somebody go so far as to make something that looks just like tefillin? Rabbi Yehuda oser b'hadashot umatir bishanot. Rabbi Yehuda prohibits the new ones and permits the old ones, meaning he permits you to put on and wear the old tefillin, meaning the tefillin that are clearly tefillin, even on Shabbat, to walk them into the chatzer. Now, but chadashot, no. Alma mar savar tarach inish, or mar savar lo tarach inish. It seems that one says tarach inish, that a person will sometimes do something extraordinarily time-consuming because he wants to. We don't know why. He makes a kameah look exactly like tefillin. So too, somebody might do that with techelet strings. Right, and it might really be just a kameah, really be fake. That's what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Rabbi Yehuda is saying if it's new, in other words, if it doesn't have the knot, don't bring it in, because probably, even though it looks like it might be tefillin, it's also possible that the person just made something that looks like tefillin. So too, he would say, if you found techelet strings, even though they look like techelet strings, maybe, just maybe, somebody, for some unusual reason, made something that looked just like techelet strings. Rabbi Meir, on the other hand, is saying that when you see something that looks like a tefillin, even though it doesn't have the knot, don't assume the person made a kameah that looks like tefillin. That's outlandish. Why would somebody go so far to do that? So too, Rabbi Meir would say, if you find tzitzit, don't assume that somebody went out of their way to make tzitzit that look just like real tzitzit. Assume that they are real tzitzit. Now, going just back for 1 second to the sugya before about the women's wearing of tefillin, and the women's leaning, and the women using shofar, and so on. So Tosafot has a little bit of a different approach here. He wants to say that all these mitzvot, it's not like Rashi says that we're concerned that by doing a mitzvah that you're not obligated in, you're adding on to the mitzvah. Okay? It's not that according to Tosafot. Tosafot says each one of these mitzvot actually has an element to it which is a negative. In other words, tefillin requires guf naki. You have to have a pure body, you have to be clean, you have to be prepared to wear tefillin. And maybe the woman is not going to be able to keep that high standard. Okay? When it comes to nashim somechot, leaning on the korban, you're using the korban to support your weight. So if it's not a mitzvah, it's an averah. So to going aliyah laregel, it looks like you're bringing korbanot that are not required, and you're not allowed to just come and bring a barbecue to the Beit HaMikdash. You're only allowed to bring korbanot, and you're not obligated in the korbanot. At shofar, blowing the shofar is like using a musical instrument on Yom Tov. So all of these cases, according to Tosafot, there's a negative side to it. In other words, there's something about it that you're only doing it because it's a mitzvah, and if it's not a mitzvah, it would be a problem. Okay? That's why we're worried about whether the women are obligated or not. Not because doing a mitzvah that you're not obligated in is a problem. Not because, you're allowed to do a mitzvah you're not obligated in. It's not bal tosif. But because there, in each of these mitzvot, there's a side which is pushing the envelope or somewhat of a minor problem that we override because of the fact that it's a mitzvah. But if it were not a mitzvah, we wouldn't do it. So then the question becomes, well, if the woman's not obligated, how can she do it? And Rabbi Yosei then is really saying a big chidush. He's saying even though the woman is not obligated in, let's say, simicha the korban, and even though a woman is not obligated in shofar, you know what? Since it's a mitzvah, she can do it. But wait, it's not a mitzvah for her. Why should she blow the shofar? She's going to pick up the shofar and blow it, touching something that's, she doesn't need to blow a musical instrument on Shabbat. On Yom Tov. She shouldn't do it. She doesn't need to lean on the korban. She shouldn't do it. So, she doesn't need to wear tefillin. So she shouldn't do it. So the chidush is that since it's a mitzvah, we override those minor concerns. That's how Tosafot interprets the sugya a little bit differently. He also gets into the issue of making brachot on mitzvot that you're not obligated in, which is a whole other issue that's discussed here in Masekhet Rosh Hashanah in these lengthy pieces of Tosafot here, where he compares the case of a woman to the case of, let's say, a blind person who's obligated in mitzvot midirabanan, or the case of a child who's obligated mishum chinuch. There are all different areas, all different cases where a person is not really obligated in the mitzvah, and the question is whether someone who's not obligated in a mitzvah says a baracha on the mitzvah or not, which is a major machloket rishonim on that issue. Whether we say that, like according to Rambam, that if you're not obligated in a mitzvah, you can't say asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. You can't say God commanded me to do this. And then on the other extreme, you have Rabbeinu Tam, who says that anytime you're doing a mitzvah, it's part of the mitzvah to say the baracha. And then you have other opinions that say, well, since you're getting sachar, you're getting the reward for the mitzvah, you should be able to say the baracha, and so on. So that's a major discussion in the Rishonim on this daf as well.